Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Hello, welcome to the 2026 Digital Humanities Distinguished Lecture. I'm Max Evgen. I'm the Assistant Director of Engagement and Communication in Digital Humanities. Just to let you all know, there's coffee and hot cocoa and cookies and tea in the back, and there's a sign-in sheet in the back too. So if you please, before you leave, please write your name in the sign-in sheet in the back. We'd really appreciate that. I want to tell you a little bit about Natalie Phillips. Natalie Phillips is Associate Professor of English, Affiliated Faculty in Cognitive Science Program, and founder and co-director of the Digital Humanities and Literary Cognition Lab, the DHLC, is also core faculty in the Digital Humanities at Michigan State University. She specializes in 18th century literature, the history of the mind, cognitive approaches to fiction, and disability studies. Her first book, Distraction, Problems of Attention in 18th Century Literature, traces how changing Enlightenment ideas about the unfocused mind reshaped literary form, arguing that descriptions of distraction in narrative advanced and often complicated scientific theories of concentration. She is also a leading figure in the emerging field of literary neuroscience, pioneering a series of interdisciplinary experiments that use neuroscientific tools such as fMRI and eye tracking to explore the cognitive dynamics of literary reading. Current experiments in progress at the DHLC include an fMRI study of literary attention in Jane Austen, a neuroscientific study on the pleasures of poetry reading, a cross-cultural project on narrative perceptions of music, and most recently, creativity in the time of COVID-19, art as a tool for combating social inequity and injustice. Her second book project, tentatively titled Literary Neuroscience and the Aesthetics of the Brain, grows out of this cross-disciplinary research, modeling a more reciprocal relationship between literature and neuroscience in interdisciplinary experiments and historicizing literature renderings of the brain from the 18th century to the present. She is also beginning another book project after leading accessible art initiatives with a focus on neurodiversity, 2014 to the present. During COVID-19, she has also begun writing an autobiography about living with her disability, Teaching from the Floor, Adventures of a Neurological Disorder. Phillips and the DHLC's research has appeared in high-impact collections by Oxford University Press, MIT Press, Routledge, Cambridge University Press, etc., and has been featured by NPR, BBC, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Her multidisciplinary work also has been supported by a variety of national and international research grants and foundations, including the ACLS Mellon, the National Science Foundation, the Teagle Foundation, and the Wallenberg Foundation of Sweden. Today, it's our pleasure to introduce Natalie's talk, The Value of the Cognitive, Connecting Digital Humanities to Reader Response and Audience Studies. And so I'd like you to welcome our 2026 Distinguished Lecturer, Natalie Phillips.
All right. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you for that warm welcome from Max. I'm delighted to be here, and I really appreciate you guys being here, particularly in this wild weather. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm a professor in English, and I do cognitive science and DH and disability studies and all these things. And accessible, our lab does everything from fMRI studies to accessible art exhibitions. And so yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. I am also a professor, as mentioned, with disability. And so what that means is it can result in episodic muscle spasms that probably won't, but can take me to the ground. They also, if I release my masking, will cause episodic muscle spasms in my gut that will lead to sort of vocal disruptions and rhythmic disruptions, double, triple vision, some vertigo, nice mix of neurological challenges. So what that means, though, is that I want to invite you to play, if this happens, with the disruptive rhythms that this creates in a traditional academic talk, and also to claim the space however your body-mind would like to. So feel free to move around, to sit on the floor if you'd like, to grab food in the middle, to go head out and use the restroom, right? Like this is an open space. All right, so one of the questions I'd like to raise for today is, how do people feel when they read literature or engage with art? And what captures our attention when we read or engage in different ways? And what experiences actually stay with us, creating lasting impressions in our mind and memory? This is particularly important in DH, I think, particularly when it comes to everything from corpus analysis to digital archives, because we need to know what connects them with people, often to people's feelings. So I'll be coming at these questions by talking about 3 projects. The first, as mentioned, an fMRI study on people bringing different levels of attention to Jane Austen, which has experimental results that suggest strong emotions represented in a literary text help capture readers' attention and encode them in memory. The second, an experiment on aesthetic pleasure in poetry, has to do with what people are feeling, rather than what the feelings are in the text that are attracting people, and what they enjoy and find beautiful, or don't, when they read literature. And the third and last has to do with emotional responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and to our archive about it. And so I'll talk briefly, hopefully briefly, we'll watch me try to speed, about our digital work gathering examples of how people turn to creativity in the time of COVID, and how audiences, again, responded to our archive at MSU, as well as a new project thinking about how everyday creativity can improve how healthcare workers are feeling in times of stress and burnout. All right. So the fact that I bring a cognitive perspective to all these DH projects means that I'm always doing DH, moving between the qualitative and the quantitative with a focus on the human and the humanities. But it also means I'm using tools that you don't often see, I think, in DH, integrating data from brain scans to psychological surveys to open-ended literary responses. And ultimately, I'll suggest, what I want to suggest, so I'm going to be like a salesperson, I want to suggest that cognitive tools can not necessarily be reductive, but can actually provide a richer picture of the complex ways we engage with literature and art, and also provide a framework for reconnecting some of our traditionally broad-scale maps and graphs in digital humanities back to the individual readers and viewers, as well as to the embodied mind. So one of the things that really got me excited about starting to do this work in neuroscience was actually something that was about letting us move away from single brain regions, the kind of images you see often in like a pop psych image, and it was actually towards more dynamic personal maps of brain activity. It was coming out from the Gallant Lab. And they were able to, in the images on the left, what we see is what someone was looking at inside an fMRI scanner. And on the right, what we see are incredibly complex visual reconstructions of what people were viewing, derived only from that person's brain activity. You following? Based on the YouTube clips that they were seeing before. So with advances in machine learning since then, they've now remapped these brain images so much that they match the color, shape, and motion in the reconstructions, again, left, right, to the degree that is now, I think, unbelievably uncanny. And you can train the algorithm to recognize a personal brain image pattern. And we can come back to the complex statistics behind this and what it means to look at that and think of brain imaging, but in 15 minutes to an hour. All right, so it's these possibilities for personalization and the appreciation of individual difference that I hope you'll hold in mind as we move forward. All right, first Austen. So our fMRI experiment on literary attention in Austen, known in the media, I'm going to say it, try not to say it too ironically, as your brain on Jane, is actually not about Austen, but about the levels of attention we can bring to literature. It's exploring cognitive differences in close reading, or literary analysis, and pleasure reading, aka hypothetically getting lost in a good book. So after reading chapter 1 of Mansfield Park for pleasure outside the scanner, to get a sense of individual reading time, also to get used to the fact that they were reading Jane Austen, 18 literary PhD participants went into the fMRI to read chapter 2, moving through the chapter in 32 blocks of text. Very natural reading conditions, but shockingly at the time and still today, at their own speed, and by pushing a button in their hand and reading through a mirror that is actually right above their eyes in the scanner that reflects back to a screen at the back of the hole in the bore. And as they read, they switched between close reading for 8 blocks and pleasure reading 8 blocks, and again, ×2 for the full chapter. As we gathered data about brain activation, eye tracking, heart rate, respiration, and more, and for big dorks, the selections were randomized. All right, so experimental technologies. So the first technology we're using, fMRI, gives us a dynamic picture of blood flow in the brain. Basically, where neurons, which need oxygenation, are firing and when. We were also one of the first groups who had been able to integrate fMRI-compatible eye tracking in the neuroscience of reading, which let us see, where people's eyes are moving, the pattern of saccades, these sort of micro jumps that the eye makes in reading, as well as moments where readers speed up, slow down, or reread. And as you'll see was crucial, we ended with literary essays, which are, in fact, the most exciting part. So how many of you guys have actually been inside an MRI? Yeah? Yeah. They're chaotically loud. So I honestly wasn't sure that anyone could read, much less close read or pleasure read, and Jane Austen inside a loud scanner. So I was surprised by a number of things, and we were surprised. First, on the left, by the fact that so many people described, no, it's gone. First, there's an image that shows how many people describe succeeding. 80 to 90% said that they could actually close and pleasure read Austen in the scanner. And we'll see that actually a handful said Mansfield Park helped distract them from the scanner noise. The second on the slide on the right, I was surprised by the level and wide breadth of activity that we were seeing. This is happening, and you see in the red and yellow, those are the regions activating for close reading as opposed to pleasure reading. Blue and white are pleasure reading. And this is happening in regions, in this case, for the somatosensory cortex and motor cortex and beyond, that are far beyond what you would expect for an attention shift, especially with everyone reading the same thing, just in two different ways. Now, what's even cooler, as you can see, how these brain regions change based on the individual reading, which is something fMRI imaging can show. It's just not often done that way. So I want you guys thinking back to that original map of someone's reading unfolding over time, right? And so each person shows slightly different activation for how they close read Austen's text, as well as how they pleasure read, which is what we see is activating, particularly in subject 16. The second surprise, which I think is even more exciting, this is the one that shows how often actually people, is that basically people were able to close read inside the scanner. Not only do we know that based on the quality of their essays, they actually ended up quoting those 18 subjects 168 times directly, like word for word, from the text they read in the scanner, and correctly. And they're actually quoting them by memory, word for words, at times noting things down to the semicolon structure of Austen's sentences. So this, as we can see in this next case, mapping these quotes across the sections of the novel, moreover, these humanist methods, right, of actually approaching the literary essays, getting these close readings and individual differences, actually lets us have extremely rich data in terms of a written record of what people paid attention to. So you can see patterns where the story captured attention across the group. Something's clearly going on in sections 8 and 9 or 25. We can think about 20, 32, that's kind of the end. That's clearly not happening in the sections that are low quoted. And so we came up, looking at these sections, we came up with two hypotheses, and people seemed to be drawn to really intense emotional moments in the text. And this is Mansfield Park. How many of you guys have actually read Mansfield Park? Okay, this is why we picked Mansfield Park, because it was the one least number of people would have read, seen a movie screening of, et cetera. But there's a lot of moments where this poor heroine has been adopted by her incredibly snobby relatives, and the attention is often captured by insults in the narrative. And so we picked up on this, and we wanted to do some sentiment analysis. To our frustration and amusement, this was something that kept eluding sentiment analysis, largely because of Austen's irony and the fact that deeply hypocritical characters would say over and over again that Fanny should be good and grateful, and all these things, all these positive words kept emerging around sections that in fact should have been negatively ranked because the heroine ends up sobbing at the end, like crying on the stairs. They also seem to be captivated by objects. And as you can see here, for one of the highly quoted sections of Mansfield Park, subjects are drawn to more concrete nouns and verbs, which led to our concreteness study, where we basically, sorry, this is just like moving through just different subjects going through, but you can, we basically decided based on this, and I'm gonna start to fly because I'm gonna lose you guys on the Austen study. But we were like, all right, let's go with the concreteness, leave emotions behind for a second. We designed a GUI with the help of Russ and basically took a really robust study that used like around 40,000 word lemmas and ranked their concreteness on a scale of 1 to 5. We went through and found Austen's nouns and verbs. And we're like, hey, how concrete is this section? How concrete are the words that were being quoted? And guess what? Indeed, the moments that were quoted were radically concrete. That had nothing necessarily to do with the essays people wrote. They wrote essays about gender, about class, about like incredibly sophisticated literary structures, but what they were quoting were often really concrete objects. We had sashes, we had shrubbery, we had all of this. And so we were like, okay. But when I went like a few months ago to Claremont to participate in a group that was looking at neuroscience, DH, AI, thinking about affect studies, I realized that a lot of these moments where we see heightened affect are actually around moments of concrete examples. So she was in bed crying. Crying itself is a concrete verb. Right, we can imagine someone crying much easier than we can imagine them pontificating, which is possibly what I'm doing right now. But right, so we're on the stairs, you imagine her on the bed. There's a moment where she has a half-eaten gooseberry tart, where she then goes off and weeps. But people remember the gooseberry tart as a way to sort of invoke this larger structure. So to give you a sense of this, right, and I'll just give you like a little fragment of the essays. Here's a subject offering just some moments. And in this quote about the attic stairs, they're talking largely about her relationship to the physical space of the house in their final close reading essay. And so in the moment that they're reading about the attic stairs, we could hypothetically be able to look back and be able to start to see how these connections between the concreteness and the emotion open up. And this connection between strong insults, because people are often calling Fanny stupid, and so his, not just Mrs. Norris, but Lady Bertram, is a moment that is the clearest when this person actually quotes and says that Lady Bertram says to Fanny that she was stupid but must take more pains. And basically a lot of people quote this moment about stupidity and quote directly from the novel and talk about how the lady actually compares this young woman to her dog, her pug. And people remember the dog as a way to remember this class lesson in reducing the girl to someone who's good simply at fetching and carrying. So we can talk about this in future directions for Q&A, how to even think about correlating that kind of sentiment analysis with a level of concreteness and brain imaging. But this is the kind of interdisciplinary work at the level of voxels in the brain, at the level of individual patterns that then can connect with large-scale patterns in the text that I get most excited about in this work. And it means there's a ton of research directions. All right, next. So one question that came up most often after the Austen study was whether or not people could quote from the Austen novel 168 times because they were PhDs in literature. Right, because they were being tested on the subject that they knew, right? There's nothing like having your brain scanned and wondering whether you're doing it well enough. And so when I was invited to join a global collaboration in neuroaesthetics at NYU, looking at how we respond to beauty or aesthetic pleasure in art, music, and literature, I couldn't help but want to focus on thinking about this question of literary training. And I really did think that we were going to see that literature majors were going to have a really strong difference from non-English majors and STEM majors. Part of this, we decided to use sonnets. That's because you can actually control that pretty well for rhyme and meter, things like this. We picked these examples. We were even like, will we see a difference between an Elizabethan and Petrarchan sonnets? No. But basically, one of the coolest things, it's one of the first behavioral studies, I think, as it evolved, to look at real-time aesthetic pleasure in poetry reading. And basically, what we did, 25 English majors and 25 non-English majors read 16 sonnets online. As they read each poem, they noted how much they liked it, and answered a bunch of other quantitative questions about how aesthetically pleasing they found each one and how much imagery they thought was in it and how they were feeling. But they actually had to go through and highlighted what was new is that as they went through for their second round of reading, our participants actually highlighted the moments of the poem they noted liking most. And I'm going to say, or more accurately, because I was not pleased with aesthetic pleasure and the beauty thing, we found most powerful, pleasurable, or moving was the language we used to mark green. And the moments they didn't in red. And this gave us a unique picture of the ebb and flow, you can see, of pleasure and displeasure, just get it down, as they read a sonnet in the moment. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So as you can see for this one individual, and this is Claude McKay, it moves quickly back and forth between the green and the red. This person liked the first dawn, but didn't like the second. And then when you collect them together, all of the individuals reading this sonnet, right, you can see the collected highlighting patterns. Moving into darker and darker green, the more participants highlighted it. So they really liked their eyes wine weakened. We wondered about college. But so I thought we'd see a lot of differences, right? And again, when we started this, one study in Japan had found that we could predict just from the brain images, sorry, this is negative. One study had shown that you could predict just from the brain images whether or not someone had been looking at a painting by Picasso or by Dali. And I was, again, we just started. I was like, okay, literature, non-lit majors, this is going to be key. And then all of my students since then have been yelling at me about my elitism. Anyway, and there are differences. They were also able to identify which people were art majors. So, but when we compared the two groups, there were differences. There were differences in which sonnets people liked, but what was astounding is that when we compare the two groups, the English majors and the STEM majors, non-English majors, the similarities are what are astonishing. And as this slide shows, it's just one poem here. It's poem K called The Sheaves. But their highlighting patterns, this is aesthetic pleasure, they shift seemingly almost in tandem, right? We've got, and this is the, walking away. Well, these are the words of the sonnet, right? And these are the number of positive highlights for each word. And so basically, what we're seeing is, you would see it's okay, this is one example, but it just keeps going, right? Which means that word by word patterning, we're seeing people's pleasure ebb and flow in unbelievably similar ways in responding to that text, suggesting that, I'm going to fly over this next section. How are we doing on time?
Really good.
Really good? Well, then, take our freaking time. Is that it looks like there are certain, basically, it's like that literary pleasure, that the pleasure we take in poetry, that is not about literary training. Right? That our responses to the text are rooted in something far deeper. And I find that in itself gorgeous and fascinating and more democratic. And then we went back and we're like, what's going on again with these peaks, right? What is leading to the moments where the most people are like, I find this to be powerful, pleasurable, or moving. And we noticed that the things, again, that captured them were things like imagery, metaphors, personification. So it's moments when, like, the ocean breathes, or the Catskill eagle rises like a flame. And I've got links in my notes. I'm not sure I'll be able to call up this fast, but that will take us to each of those poems so we can look at them in context. And then when people in the poetry study, which we thought, okay, they're not going to be able to remember which poem they were reading. It's not going to be like Austen where you can recall by memory what you were doing, but they recalled by memory, right, when they were asked what stood out to them in reading this poem. They describe over and over again what moments they recalled liking, and they mention the imagery, right? And particularly, as well as the metaphors. We haven't highlighted the metaphors in each of these, right? But it becomes this pattern of how even they're responding to their own processing, which is why I love open-ended questions and want to advise it for everything. But so what's really cool here is that we can come back to both those individual maps of poetic pleasure from each person from the beginning and trace both the patterns that align across these groups, right? And then what makes them unique. So with that, a leap to creativity in the time of COVID. So I want to end by talking about some new directions from our latest work. Supported by the Mellon Foundation, it's Creativity in the Time of COVID, and it's a project that has been archiving the diverse ways that people turned to creative outlets during the pandemic. With a particular focus, in this case, on individuals from BIPOC, LGBTQIA+, and disability communities. And in the larger archive, there are now I'm really excited to say, there are now around 2,000 artworks from across the globe, giving us a really rich sense of some of the ways that people have, in fact, identified their own creativity and turned to it during this period. Using this, we've been able to begin, but we want to just almost advertise this as a way for others to use as a research tool to even begin to explore and map the diverse art forms being used during this time, explore the role of art in healing and mental health, because we gathered the artworks along with stories from the individuals about what was going on in their own personal COVID experience, and examining the ways that art served as a tool to facilitate social change and build community identities around social justice. So, since one of the directions this work is going is towards health humanities, I'm going to focus on two examples from the medical community. So these gorgeous posters, and my body is going to do this, yep. Were created by a hospital chaplain in New York City, and who was mourning their partner who had died of leukemia, and decided to create individualized posters for people that were passing away in the hospice ward. And each person, right, was being obscured from focus by the protective equipment. And so he went to the families and talked to each of them about things that really rendered each person, what was their favorite color? What was something they particularly loved? All of these questions to get a sense of them, and then created these posters, and you can just see the uniqueness that he tried to capture for each person. And then they went and were hung, right, above the bed. And he said that he wanted to do this both to grieve the patients and his partner, but also to humanize, in particular, the patients at a point when healthcare workers were facing the stress of unprecedented levels of death, right, and dehumanization amidst care. Demonstrating the breadth of response, a 70-plus psychologist instead found that he needed to turn away from patients and went to lose himself in his garden. And here you see him lost in bonsai. I mean, not lost because he's posing cheerfully for the picture. But, the act here is of cultivating the plants he loves and finding renewal as he supported patients sort of amidst the green, so going away from it to be able to come back. And so with seed grants from Circle, and from Tetrad, we were able to gather and analyze responses from 122 IAH students as they came to see our exhibition, to understand the impact of viewing some of these artworks and the stories that went along with them. If you're interested, Sion has copies of, like 5 copies of narrative booklets of examples of what were actually in the archive, so you can pass them around. Also, having something to hold in your hands at this point in the talk will help your attention. So I'll give you a little bit of early findings, and this is coming from a fabulous postdoc named Mallet Reed, Miko Blaylock, Sion Cho, and although a significant number of people responded and described themselves as being able to have themselves be transported back in time, right, by looking at some of these pieces. And we've looked through, he's looked through these responses and really found a number of pieces that really show that the act of viewing these works really took people back in time. And it helped many visualize otherwise invisible disparities. Each found different pieces emotionally powerful. So some found, and this was one of the most divisive and yet intensely powerful works in the show, a piece called Weight Bearers that was created out of masks that had sewn on them the dates and numbers of people lost to COVID on that individual day by the artist, and then built around a human figure who is then created to embody the healthcare workers that are being impacted. So some found looking at the piece too difficult to process. Things turned off. You would talk about this in cognitive science. You can think about this in terms of dehumanization. Sometimes when there's such strong, almost empathetic response, people actually activate regions that are associated with processing objects. But others actually found it to be the most powerful in the exhibit. And we're just, again, looking at survey responses to this. And also, thanks to our collaborators from Circle, especially Miko Blaylock and Chelsea Wentworth, we were able to introduce pieces of pandemic art into an MSU med school class, allowing us to gather another set of data, right, very different from an IH class, about how these paired examples of pandemic story and art work to engage folks in the medical education spaces in particular. So now we're sort of into new realms. And as this is evolving, we're beginning to explore a new project, Art as Medicine, which is basically thinking about how, basically, I think it's in part because health and well-being was such a strong theme in all of our submissions. We really became interested in how creativity could shape both patient and doctor experiences. And that it's becoming Art as Medicine, where we're basically exploring how healthcare professionals incorporate everyday creativity beyond the pandemic into their everyday lives, to manage stress, to handle all sorts of things. And right now we're building a virtual exhibition based on creativity and COVID, but adding works to that, planning to add works to that, to see, right, to ask people and ask them to contribute what creative outlets you gravitate towards, and collecting these examples. And the goal is actually to have that be incorporated into the virtual exhibit and design an experiment that explores how doing this and incorporating these personalized acts of everyday creativity. Because again, everyone's got their own bonsai, right? That we're going to be, like as we're speaking, we're thinking about how this can be a method for managing stress and improving well-being, but we just did a poster on this and were approached about a possible collaboration with engineering and nursing. And it's a group who are already using wearable devices to track stress and burnout in healthcare workers. And so the idea would be that we would bring in the everyday creativity angle in through the virtual exhibition, looking at how micro moments of creativity might impact these, again, individualized physiological responses in real time. So I'll end with like in the Austen study and the poetry study, blending tools from cognitive science, digital humanities, and beyond would allow us to move between the shared patterns that connect us and the ones that make us unique, which is the point I'd like to leave you on, the value of integrating cognitive tools as a way of exploring both the individual and the collective across multiple projects using DH. And with that, thank you for your attention. And a huge thank you to the lab and to all of our collaborators along the way. And to that moment for being like, and we're done. Oh, it's not on?
Not one is.
If anybody has any questions, we've got 2 microphones here, and you could come to the microphone and have a question for Natalie. That's super.
I went really fast.
Okay, sorry. It didn't sound like, I couldn't tell if it was on. Anyway, you can always rely on me to try with the talk. Thank you so much, Natalie. It's really exciting to be able to have this time to kind of look at this work that's been going on for so long and kind of think about it as connected and seeing how it's flowed as kind of as a career thus far. And so congratulations on all of that, because it's a lot to try to navigate. Also, kind of methodologically, interdisciplinarily, which is its own challenge in an institution of higher ed when we have tenure stream requirements, et cetera. So I recognize that is also its own thing that hasn't been spoken about. So I want to give voice to that, as well as kind of physically, right? Neurologically. I do actually have a question, which is that I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about how you're, with the creativity in the Time of COVID project, there's so many different things that can and have been going on and that could be going on. And so I'm really keen to hear a little bit about this kind of the global kind of archive piece of things and how it ties into the very like local, situated classroom, like museum, exhibit context, and how, especially as opportunities arise, how you balance among all of those different pieces of the larger project.
Is it on this time? Yeah. That's funny. Okay. It's really difficult to balance, right? And I think that that's actually one of the fascinating parts you're speaking to in terms of interdisciplinarity, is that when you create an interdisciplinary project that has a bunch of branches that connect, right, to multiple fields, then you are always at risk of going in too many directions at once. And I feel like what ends up happening, at least for me in the lab, is that there's a commitment to working with people who end up, like Max and I were talking about this, that the point of unconferencing is recognizing that the people who show up at any particular moment are going to be the right people. Right, and that you move forward. And we were talking about this in terms of who would appear at this talk in this crazy weather. And the ways that I balance the local and the global have to do with actually who is here at the local, right? Like the people in the lab, the students in the lab, what they're passionate about becomes a sort of pivotal center point, right? So I can grab on to something about that and use it as a way to say, like, students are going to do a project about this aspect of the local exhibition and these responses. Working with Amiko and Chelsea, right, we were able to bring in a postdoc whose expertise goes beyond what I traditionally do. We're using both digital humanities sentiment analysis and a style of quantitative data analysis that I had not been using to find some of the examples that we just gave in terms of the patterns of audience response. And then just the act of presenting that poster, right, became suddenly the pivot for the dean of engineering, I don't know who, but to suggest this larger collaboration with wearables. And so I think it's always about making sure that wherever that's going, it has to come back to the principles of where it started, right? Because it started with a commitment to inequity, thinking about structural imbalances and BIPOC disability and LGBTQI plus communities. And so if it's going to move to something really huge about wearables and nursing, it has to keep that commitment, right? And so it's like how you manage to keep that. I don't know if that answers the question well enough, but it's the sort of passion line that lets it thread through.
Others are very welcome to ask questions, so I don't want to dominate things, but that leads to kind of a follow-up, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
Which is really kind of relating to, amidst all of those opportunities and kind of developments and evolutions of the project, how have you learned how to close out pieces so that you can move on to kind of another one or let things kind of conclude?
I will be the first to say I haven't. I have not. And the Austen study is a great example of this because that was conducted 12 years ago, possibly more. And I only reopened it when I was called out for a keynote on neuroscience, digital humanities, and AI on predicting feeling. And I returned to the Austen data thinking that I was just going to do a very brief moment of pointing out some of the concreteness. And then I actually looked and I saw this aspect of the essays that I'm now absolutely committed to pursuing. And I think that for DH projects, I guess this is where I really am committed to taking a piece from STEM, is that projects don't have to have an opening and a sundowning as clearly as sometimes I think we want them to. We have this model of like exactly how this should work, and it's a software model, and it's right. But in STEM, you have branches of research. People don't do an experiment and then say, I'm never going to return to that data again. That's just like, people would be like, would you like me to close down an area of my research? And so they're fertile points of exploration. You may stop running that study, but you're not going to stop returning to the data. But yeah, but you have to reallocate your resources, right? So I think what happens in reality, so I'll give a more realistic answer, is that things go on back burner and front burner, right? And that usually there's a grant impulse and there's a aspect of something that's very much forward moving at the time, and what's immediately pressing, like, how will we get everything ready for the accessible exhibition at MSU to make it ready? And can we get the IRB approval fast enough to get it, so that all the students can get their survey responses in? And that's front and center. We're not gonna analyzing Austen data. But that when you're in a slower moment, you can sort of come back and reflect. And that moments like this for me actually have been opportunities to sort of pause and think and see the connections across some of the works, which is really nice.
Thank you for the talk. It's very fascinating. And I was struck by the subjects sometimes, or like the area of motivation relating to like passion and feeling and emotion and grief and how people process all these highly human things from these different lenses, these different methodological approaches. And I'm curious to hear how you think about like data collection and almost like what's possible or impossible. You're nodding. Is that enough of a question?
I mean, no, could you keep
Okay.
going so that I make sure I absolutely get it? But like,
Well, I'm
there's
kind
so
of
much
curious,
you
like,
can't.
oh, how do you, if you've got an inspiration or somebody brings something to you that you're like, oh, that's an interesting line, how do you, with all of the possibilities of measurement, right, how do you decide on an approach, or how do you think through these possibilities?
Okay, so this is why I think this recording may not actually go around. So back in the day when I was designing the Austen experiment, I never thought I would run it. I was and am trained in English. And so I went to a prominent cognitive scientist from MIT and said, here, have I designed it correctly? And she said, absolutely. And I went, yes. And then, I said, will you do it? And she said, well, you're going to want to analyze the data. And I said, you don't understand. I can't, right? I can't do this. But her response to me when I asked about some of this was really funny to me. And then she was like, you gather all the data you can. And it was really, really beautiful. You always want to tailor your experiments knowing what different tools can do. So fMRI can only gather data about blood, about activation in terms of oxygenation, in terms of blood flow, in terms of time stamps that happen now about once every second, but at the time I was running the study every 2 seconds. So that's a big gap in time. But we also were able to get the heart rate, some of the eye tracking, heart rate, respiration, all these things, essays. And so I was advised by the cognitive consults too to get to know how people were close reading. They said, well, do a true false test. Ask them a fake question from Mansell Park, see if they're reading, see if their eyes closed. I was like, that's not gonna do it, right? And so we got this literary essay. So I feel like one of the advantages is that, one, you can use a number of tools. You don't have to analyze all of the data, right? But you can gather a lot of the data and then see what direction, right, the analysis is going and bring in those pieces as they become relevant. I'm really glad now, thinking back to how projects interconnect, that we're thinking about wearables, and I still have somewhere that heart rate data from the Austen individuals. Plus, I watched them as they were reading, and I actually advised one person to get out of the scanner because I was like, I think you're nervous. It's okay. Come on. But so I think that you choose to get as much as possible, but then you learn as much about what the tools can do, and then you be as careful as you can about how you interpret your results, but then cross as many disciplines as you can, because that will lead to the richest results. We accidentally ran one of the first studies of people reading literature at a natural speed. I thought I just did a bad PubMed search. So yeah, did that answer the question? Kind of. I'm sort of agnostic. Yeah.
What was my question? No, it's okay.
About how you choose which data to gather, and I was like, as much as you can. Without exhausting your subjects.
Had a sub or a following question. Are there types of data that you're like, ooh, when will we be able to collect this? Yeah. Is there any, See, this is how bad your questions can be, and you can still ask them.
That is absolutely fascinating. That actually shows I am delimited by the tools. Sure. Yeah. No, because I can't yet, right now, on the spot, think outside of what the tools can do. But I would love to have the capacity So, I mean, I guess I don't know if I said it explicitly enough, but, you know, my dream when running the Austen experiment, and if we had taken the poetry study to the scanner, which we didn't, COVID and other things, including the fact that I wasn't sure there was an adequate control for aesthetic pleasure. But I think my goal was to imagine a lot of times reading doesn't get studied as a dynamic process. And I wanted to see if we could integrate the eye tracking as a way to create some of that kind of ideas of that dynamic flow. And I think that that kind of question of how, I mean, survey responses, it's so difficult, right? Even with everyday creativity, some of these questions, I guess maybe this is getting to it, right? How do you get a response from people about what's actually affecting them in the moment that is not just biased by the question you asked, not just what someone thinks they need to hear, not just sterilized by a lab and stuck inside a brain scanner, the loud brain scanner. Yeah, moving towards more and more natural spaces. And that's why I think the wearables got exciting, but that's so limited, so limited. But again, am I made incredibly nervous by the idea of getting quick and immediate access to sophisticated brain data on the ready by someone's wearable? Sure.
Hey, Dr. Phillips. Thank you for the talk. You had mentioned wanting all the data, which I think is a pretty common desire, but I'm just wondering if you ever find yourself, or if the lab ever finds itself in a situation where it's constrained in terms of time or financial constraints or technology constraints with collecting data, and if so, how you prioritize which data to collect versus which data you're gonna willingly not collect.
Yeah. No, I think this is their next step, actually, with the creativity and COVID study. And one of the advantages of the Austen study was that it was offshored. We left it at Stanford. And so a lot of the data is like hovering there in a beautifully controlled, elitistly funded institution by a collaboration that I maintain by checking in every once in a while. But the lab is constantly overwhelmed by data, and we're overwhelmed by the number of things that are being taken on. And so the question is like, just how do we pick? Keeps going back to the students, right? It's whatever at the time. Because the thing I don't think I've said enough in this talk is that the lab, I never would have I wouldn't have had any of the brain images that you saw, much less, I think I would have read some of the essays and possibly been able to do one brain image reconstruction on my own. But it came out of a class and people wanted to create a lab. So none of this would have been possible without students. And so it's always been led by what students are most interested in pursuing, right? And so it doesn't mean that changes the data you collect, but in terms of what you can keep in its most rigorous form, right, extensive form. And I think the hardest one now is gonna be creativity in COVID, because it's funny because I think I am not used to thinking of it this way, because a lot of the data that comes from the brain images and things like this can be brought down to numbers, or it can be put in files like the essays, they're Google Docs. And so it doesn't take up a huge amount of space, but all of a sudden an artwork that someone's uploaded or a sound piece, all of a sudden these are questions that I've never fully had to confront in terms of how that data is even gonna be stored. I don't know, lab leads, how do we prioritize?
Okay. I think we look at a lot of existing methodologies from people who are doing similar things to what we want to do to get a sense of what the standard practice is and what has worked in the past. And then since we are very interdisciplinary, having a variety of data sources is really important to us and seeing how those overlap. just at a very basic level, having like the quantitative and qualitative and like physiological data along with like what people provide to us in their written responses. Yeah.
We did just contact Jonathan being like, how, we need to move our things over to OneDrive. How, how will we store all of it? Anyway, yeah, so it's an ongoing challenge.
Hi. Thank you again for this wonderful talk. I just have a really quick question about something that you said before the talk. Yeah. Which you said that your experience with a neurological disorder makes you a uniquely positioned person to do this kind of research. Can you please tell us about that?
Okay, I will unmask. So, as I have, one of the things that happened, again, going back to the Austen study, is that you start these things and you think, I need to find a population of people. Like, all I was thinking is they need to not be claustrophobic. They need to not be colorblind, because it was framed in red and green. And that was just foolish. But, ideally not ADD, things like this, dyslexia. When you look across the literature PhD population, you learn very quickly that this type of neurotypical desire is not only foolish, but deeply wrong. And this is part of what began to get me interested in. But when I have experiences, say, of vertigo or of the cognitive load of managing, like holding in spasms like I am right now, and trying to keep the words coming out of my mouth and processing what I'm going to say next, I am also able to think in a totally different way about what it means to have attention overload, right? Or to experience, not just double vision from something like I have, but, all of a sudden the studies that I read are made visceral, right? And I think, again, that humanizes them in a way that is really empowering and powerful to me. Someone asked me about individual differences.
Thank you so much. In the discussion, you've talked a little bit about the Jane Austen project and the COVID project, and I'd like to come to the middle project, the memory of imagery. And this is something I'm fascinated by. And just a general question, would love to hear about how you and your lab are maybe pursuing that further. But a specific thing that came up during the discussion, you talked about the dynamic process of reading and how you'd love to have more data like while it's happening.
Yeah.
But I wonder if getting at the dynamic process of reading, actually, you can do that through memory. Like what sticks with people? So wondering about like the real-time data versus the retrospective thinking about it. So love to hear more.
No, this is again why I'm really stuck on loving all the data. I have become really fascinated over time because I was so shocked by what people can remember, and again, what people can remember from poetry, and this idea of, right, again, the real time, it's like, and getting into this nitty gritty of these 18 sonnets. But after reading the sonnets, and I don't have them to pass around to you, but I dare say, if any of you guys did all of that and read them again, I'm not sure how long anyone would remember them and what we would remember of it. And that has become a question that's become a far more deep and enduring question because of it, because I'm both so excited by what sticks with us, but also because on the plane, on the way to give talks about things, as I was like, I was crunching numbers and like responding back to the lab about some new thing about it, like, oh my gosh, the poetry things actually line up, like, oh my God, being able to talk to someone on a plane and say like, what do you remember from what you read, or what do you pay attention to? And I think that this is a question in literary studies and in humanities in general that we engage, but I think we're a little afraid to engage really deeply in terms of the amount that we forget, right? Just how little at times stays with us. And then some of the tools that we use to recall. I don't know if you guys have your own like little book lists and like, you know, just even remembering the title of the last book you read or the plot. Main characters. Yeah. And so that's something that I think, again, that pattern of real time, and then the question, it's really hard to get longitudinal data too, speaking of other things. I don't ever want to trap a bunch of people, but if you could just magically wave a wand and have everybody from a study like respond back to you 2 years later, that would be really cool. But yeah, did that?
As a literary scholar, this is something that I think about a lot, and not in terms of forgetting. It's the feeling, it's the atmosphere that sticks with you of that novel. Like, oh, I love that novel. Well, what exactly? Well, the plot, not sure, but that feeling, or the atmosphere, like it was a day like today, or that sticks with you.
Yeah. And that's what, I mean, in terms of my very informal polling of classes, which has been as far as this experiment has gone, is what people do report, right? I read it curled up in bed in this one, right, on this one day when it was the fall leaves or the following, and I remember the smell of how, or I remember the book cover, and it was like, it was blue, or I'd just gone through a breakup, and and it's so much about the feelings around our reading as well. And I feel like that's a really exciting avenue to explore. There are so many avenues to explore, but yeah.
I'm asking you about individual difference.
So.
Tell us more.
I just want everyone to read all the essays. No, I guess I wanted, because I was emphasizing so much the poetry, how similar the STEM and the English majors' responses were, I think it's really important to come back to the fact that in the end, the two groups did really like different poems, and so did different individuals. And when we, it's so common in cognitive science to, when you even look at brain images, it is the composite, it is the group result, right? That I think the ability to bring our attention to the individual differences is part of the humanities side of this work. And so with an essay, and I can come back to this, but like, there's a moment, I care about, two different responses to these examples from creativity and COVID from medical students. Like, what is the difference from one person to another, right? And so, but in the essays from the Austen study, when I came back to them, come on, baby. I'm not gonna be able to get into my notes, am I? It's one of the challenges of having sight challenges. I put this in at the last minute, but the fact that you have people, one person hooking in on these attic stairs to track the way that the rooms are too big and she is too small, and the feeling of fragility and being frightened of breaking things, and this way that an emotional state tracks with a position in various rooms, right, is so different in its own way than this other person, sort of, who happens to remember that Austen uses sea, sister, sailor, and focuses on the sibilance of the S's, to be able to get across the connection between Fanny and her brother who's gone to sea, and sort of the wispiness of his exit and the people who love her like disappearing out of this house. And it's like, okay, they share a care for this heroine's emotional situation, but they're coming in with different and crucially different and fascinating different lenses, right? And it's hooked often, at least according to my students, right, to their own personal experiences, to their training. Their literary training is different, right, to how they're even going to analyze a text. And so I guess I just wanted to say that when we were talking about gathering all the data, maybe the most important data is the literary essays kind of thing. And to say that I think that's where we can capture the individual differences.
I think that's really interesting. You're just thinking through right there is making me think about how this might kind of work with data feminist approaches and thinking about not just scale with data, but also how we use affect and emotion intentionally in how we put together visualizations, but how we force people to spend time with different types of pieces of data. And I think that I hadn't thought about this in that connection, and now I am, so thank you.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Phillips. I really appreciated hearing that your lab is driven by the interests of your students. Do you have any recommendations or advice on helping students explore their curiosity or interest in different topics?
Yes. Well, I might hand it over to the students again. But everyone just like nervously crosses their hands. But one of the things that has made me want to continue doing any of this, right? Because you're also talking about like the infinite crash, right, of all of these projects, and is the students. And one of the things I've realized very is that everyone brings that if you actually have students and bring them to the table as colleagues, not as data laborers or as interns, or I mean, it's not to say not as interns, but like really authentically bringing people into the central questions that you are wrestling with, not pulling down the mystique of having it all together and knowing how to do it and knowing when to do it and what to do next. And there were so many times, and there are so many times when I come in and I'm like, what do we do next? I don't know, right? And I think that the ability for students to know that they are trusted and I don't know, that what they care actually matters is the key. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I mean, yeah, I think I definitely agree. Like, I don't know, just I wasn't really expecting, like, going into this that, like, I was going to be asked my opinion on, like, what our focus should be for a grant worth a lot of money or, like, I don't know, anything like that. But, like, then actually seeing, like, something you say be included in, like, the final draft or, like, an idea you have actually become, like, the idea for a project. Sorry, excuse me. That we do. Like, I don't know, it's just very, like, empowering. It's like, yeah, you're more capable than you think. And I think also the collaborative nature of it, like, you can do a lot of just bouncing ideas off of people, and it's very, like, low stakes. If I say something dumb, then it just gets flushed away in the sea of other ideas that people have. So, I don't know, yeah.
I agree. In terms of empowering students, I think everyone has a perspective, and if they're invited to share that perspective, a lot of people will want to. And if they're consistently acknowledged in that perspective and it's incorporated into the direction of the lab, then people will be more encouraged to share and more encouraged to contemplate things on their own.
I agree. I think you both put it very well.
I think the openness of the environment also helps. It's a very, it's an environment where everybody has a lot of room to share their ideas. And it's, as Braden said, very empowering knowing that those ideas will be taken into consideration.
But yeah, I mean, you're coming in from a library perspective, right? Where you're like, how do we get people to just like trust that they can do, right? And I actually do believe this. It's like about telling people the process of that you don't know, like, I don't know, just the willingness to admit lack of knowledge at a level that is very real.
Some context, I'm thinking about this as someone who's wanting to support student projects within our department.
Yeah.
Just like thinking about like how do you develop that welcoming environment where students can have the empowerment to think about what their interests are.
That's awesome. Yay.
Thank you.
But no, it's hard. I don't know. The students also come somewhat magically. I don't know, Kyle. No.
Great talk, Natalie. It was really fun listening to that. But I was curious about like when you talk about concreteness with the Austen study, and then also with the poetry study, like how the aesthetic moments people found like pleasurable were also, I mean, like the imagery is also a concrete thing. I guess I'm just curious, like, what are like the implications of that for like the study of literature, like, or even like I guess like writing, like I don't know, like copywriting, like a manual for instructions or something. Like, what are the implications of like that finding?
I mean, I think that comes back to the question about memory. And I did immediately, we went to a cognitive studies conference, and we had a discussion with DH folks about how interesting it would be to look at the moments that are most quoted in literary scholarship and see how concrete those turned out to be. I was surprised to learn there are concrete verbs. I mean, it was silly. Like, I didn't know this before we started looking at objects. I mean, it makes sense that some verbs are easier to imagine than others. But yeah, I think it has really strong implications. And at first, I think people were really kind of just like, okay, well, people are interested in objects. You know, it's like a form of thing theory, like we're noticing gooseberry tarts and tables and shrubbery. It made me think of Monty Python. But really to think about how important the ability to transport yourself into a certain world is. And I think this particular context is very important as well. Austen's chapter is very abstract. And so it's possibly not accidental that people hooked on to these very concrete moments. But I do think it's really important for thinking about how in our lives, since I'm going to go big, I might as well, how often we ourselves may associate a strong emotional moment with an object or a specific place that you can imagine, and ground, so the idea of grounding, right? Grounding oneself or grounding one's memories, and how much that attachment is there. And so really, I think you're sort of taking it towards like education and thinking about creative writing and things like this. And I mean, I think there would have to be a lot more done than just a study of the second chapter of Austen, because you know me. But I think it's the starting point.
I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's super interesting. And when the work was being talked about earlier, I kept on thinking about like totemic like objects, and how it's like, oh, there are these few, the sort of sparseness, I don't know this chapter, but the sparseness of the concrete object allows those like high contrast objects and instances to then pull to all those other emotional feelings all throughout the chapter. That sounds super interesting. And it relates a lot to like cognitive religious studies. I don't know, there's this book I was reading called Making God Real that all of this seems to echo with, and that's about like how people's prayer can involve like certain prayer technologies, almost like practices, involve very purposeful imagery, but not every prayer tradition does. It's like highly variable, but then you practice it. In the book, they talk about witchcraft and like how there's a specific coaching around imagining yourself in a walled garden, and then gradually you can add things to it. and you develop these totems.
system.
Yeah, super interesting. So I don't have a question.
That's awesome. That actually, I love how I'm like, that's a conversation. Yeah, because there's so much too with religious practices too of tactile, right, as well, of the totemic. But it is very true that the rest of the chapter is very abstract. And so these are forming sort of kind of anchors to even just be able to hold on to and to attach that larger meaning. And I do think it echoes with this larger question and also the level of abstractness of of certain forms of distress, like what it means to be forlorn, or some of the Austen-like terms that are used to describe her feelings that people aren't remembering, but they're remembering, again, the half-eaten gooseberry tart, but that we are holding that as a way to sort of carry the emotion. We also, in the poetry study, just to jump, we did a measure called the ViviQ, speaking of all the data being fun and good. It's actually a measure of the different levels that people actually imagine things in their mind when presented with narratives. And so different people imagine things in text at different level of intensity. So someone just reading a description of someone walking into a room may imagine in incredible detail this mansion. I'm someone, I happen to not. I have a strong auditory. So I imagine if someone talks about a horn, I'll hear the horn. And so we did measure the differences as well in that. So when you talk about the training, right, of that religious imagery, that's also really fascinating and important. The act of that you actually had to learn, or there's practices to learn that kind of visualization to concrete.
Also have a quick thought. Your discussion reminds me of the formalist view of language, which really emphasize, deviation, between the lines. For example, I may say old car, but I may also say a beat up shabby truck. I may say, he had warm hello for total strangers, but our ordinary speech is like he greeted the strangers warm, so yeah, that could also be relevant to other disciplines. Yes, my interdisciplinary interpretation of your study.
Yeah, no, this is something, again, this is why I want to keep returning to this freaking Austen study. But, one of the things I realized, again, when I went back to our students' interests, and we were so nervous at the beginning with those quotes, and the only thing that counted was a direct quote. So if it did not, you could identify exactly where someone was in the text and where they were in the block and where they were in the sentence, but they said distressed instead of forlorn, but they gave every indication that it is that exact line. It's not a quote, right? Or it's not even a reference. So we haven't even, so to speak to your point, we haven't even begun to explore the ways that the textual, right, dynamics or the textual ways that people are expressing themselves in their essays relate back to the text they read in an open-minded way that doesn't just have to do with did they actually use the exact same word? So I think that brings it up really well. If they didn't say truck.
Kind of combining the creativity in the time of COVID-19 and the Mansfield study, would you ever consider doing kind of brain studies on people doing more tactile activities? Because just looking at people's brains while engaged in creative activities like doing art and stuff like that. Yeah.
So one of my favorite fMRI studies to talk about has to do with jazz piano. And it's a creativity study. And Charles Lim actually designed a little piano that had no magnetic parts because fMRI is one big magnet. And then jazz pianists were playing, basic lines and then improvising on it, and you have this whole tactile component to the piano. I haven't seen people work with the tactile, but we have a lot of tactile examples in our creativity and COVID moment archive. And I think that, to return back to the concreteness and, right, this sense of embodiment, that's an aspect that really hasn't been explored. I think in part, again, about limitations of your instruments. You have to lay inside that scanner. And so one of the things is that you pad people's heads with pillows. They can't look down. And if anyone moves their head, you get the wrong brain region. Of course, this makes for very unnatural reading, as I mentioned, above a screen, right? Like a mirror above your eyes, pushing a button to advance to the next page. People are always like, did you bring a novel in? I'm like, no. I think you could. I think for many knitters, right? Nobody's looking down. That's part of, right? You're doing it while doing a bunch of other things. I'd have to look. I think that there are works out there. And I think that could be a really crucial part of the Everyday Creativity Project. I don't think I would necessarily, I think the question here is like, and I always talk to students about this, we do interdisciplinary experiment design, is what kind of question do we want to answer? And do we need the brain imaging? Do we want to know about the regions that are being activated? Or do we want to know something else? Do we want to know about their personal experience? Like, do we want to hear from them about how it affected them? Do we want to know, again, about heart rate? Do we want to know about, again, like, what's the question? And then, I guess that's the other part of the talk, like, what's the question? And then you find your tools, right? And then you ask Kyle whether or not we have enough data space. No, but like, yeah, but this is why I do the interdisciplinary experiments. But I do imagine we always have billion-dollar funders. So, but no, I think that would be fascinating. You're welcome.
Just a quick comment and kind of a close-ended question. Circling back to what you had asked Dr. Phillips about thoughts of encouraging student contribution, I think really what it comes down to is how humble you are. That it always amazes me how successful you are and yet how you show up just very humble. And I think about my experiences with my own professors in class, that the ones that show up just like they don't know everything makes me feel like I could contribute something meaningful. And then just to close in the question, do you feel as though because you work primarily in the humanities that there's more of a pressure to sunset projects? Like I think about how if there's a project of like translating Portuguese maritime poetry by Macau scholars of the 19th century, it's less seen as like a valuable project than like mapping the genome of fruit flies. And so I think there's a lot more perhaps pressure in the humanities to close the loop. Do you find that as well, or do you think that's a non-factor?
No, I think that's definitely a factor, right? And I think that our book model as well is like, that, and because it's supposed to be so individual, traditionally, right? Not in a digital humanities context, but in the humanities often it's like, you work on your monograph, and then you do your research, and then and then you need to stop that and move on. I do think, I think that, but there is a lot of room also. No one would ever be like, put that data away. Do you know what I mean? Like, for a humanities researcher, I also think it's fascinating as well. Nobody would be like, you're still, like, there's a researcher who's done brilliant work on the history of memory, Mary Carruthers. She wrote a book called The Book of Memory and the Art of Memory and the Craft of Memory. Like, all of these. And no one would be like, stop it with the memory history, And so I think that part of the interdisciplinary challenge is realizing, and I hope what I'm communicating and translating today is that a study of Austen is not just a study of Austen, right? That that it's not about just reaching the end and finding the results and being like, and here was the answer, and now ciao. Like, But that the act of coming back, you come back from different directions. The data looks entirely different. You have so many data sources. We could run an entire thing now with her. Now that we've noticed this connection between, I'm going to talk to Jonathan about the environmental, the emotional sentiment analysis that's possible, acknowledging the hypocrisy of some of the characters and its relationship to other concrete anchors in the text. And I think, that could go somewhere. But again, you have to sort of just play. That's part of why I am so committed to the openness, is I feel like the part that keeps this alive is that ability to be excited again by what's been done. And that I hope DH also kind of gives us as well. Not to say we don't have to sundown projects.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie, for the presentation, for preparing all this for us, for giving this wonderful example of all of your research agenda and all this great knowledge around how you're working with students and empowering students and all this. This has just been a really rich discussion, and thank you so much for this. Thank you all for coming. Please do fill out a sign-in sheet as you go. But also, I want to call attention to, we have a couple other events coming up. We have our we have the Global Digital Humanities Symposium is happening on April 13th to 17th. The 13th is in person right here in this room. Happening on the 13th, on the 14th and 15th, it's going to be online, and on the 17th, it's in Universidad de Monterrey in Mexico. All of it will be live streamed, so if you can't be here in person, you can watch the live stream via YouTube. And the virtual stuff is on Zoom and live streamed to YouTube as well, and will be bilingual, English and Spanish, in the Zoom. Also on April 23rd, we have our end of year celebration, which will have presentations from the Cal DSL Digital Arts Fellows, from people who got funding for Project Incubator stuff, and a variety of other people, and people can also just present about anything they've been doing, anything they've been working on, and we'll be schmoozing and everything. That's going to happen in the Leader Lab over at 112 Old Horticulture. And I'd love to see all of you there. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank you again to Natalie. Thank you, Ava. Thank you to all of the students who came in to talk about your experiences in the lab. And have a wonderful day. And yeah, please do sign in sheet in the back. Thanks so much.